Thanks for having me here today. I'm Tim Rohan from UMass Amherst. It's a great honor to be here today. And I want to thank Pamela Karimi, Tom Stubblefield, and Anna Dempsey for having me, as well as all the students. And I really enjoyed hearing the presentations from Danielle and Connor. And I greatly appreciate, I really enjoyed hearing Jennifer McGrory speak about the renovations to the building. This is the first time I've seen the renovations, so I'm really excited to see it. I think it looks fantastic. I've been here quite a few times over the years, but not many times in recent years. I remember driving here on the highway and coming upon this place and finding it absolutely magnificent and thinking that I'd really found a hidden treasure that nobody knew about. And yet it was in the Northeast, in a thickly settled area not far from major places, and I thought it was just an amazing and astonishing place. So today what I want to talk about is I want to talk about Rudolph's intentions for designing this place and other places in Massachusetts in a larger context. And actually the excellent talks that we've heard today have almost preempted what I have to say. So maybe I will talk more about the context of Rudolph's Boston projects to kind of, so that I don't, so I'm not redundant. Okay. So the title of the talk is been conflated here a little bit with my own titles and things, but it's Bay State Renaissance, Paul Rudolph's 1960s projects for Boston and Southeastern Massachusetts. Paul Rudolph enjoyed fantastic success in the early 1960s. It was almost impossible to open a newspaper, magazine, or architectural journal in the US or abroad without seeing one of his many projects or reading his opinions about the state of modernism. In 1963, the year his best-known structure, the Yale Art and Architecture building, was completed, which we see right here, Rudolph was working simultaneously on 6 governmental, 5 academic, and 3 corporate projects. Beginning in the 1950s, in cities like New Haven and accelerating in the 1960s under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, government-supported redevelopment transformed America's cities and provided Rudolph with numerous new commissions for civic buildings. The building of new academic campuses and the expansion of existing ones, often publicly funded as well, also provided with many jobs. In a relatively short period of time, Rudolph really transformed his practice. He had been an architect of vacation houses in Florida, and suddenly he became the architect of big architecture for big government in the Northeast. These new projects by Rudolph and his contemporaries were celebrated across the nation for ushering in a new, bolder, and more monumental modernism, often compared to the architectural achievements of the Italian Renaissance and Baroque periods. That was very much on their minds, and it later became known as Brutalism, a term that Rudolph never once used to describe his own architecture. Rudolph built his most significant public projects in the 1960s in Massachusetts: Boston Government Service Center in 1962 to 1971, and the campus for the Southeastern Massachusetts Technological Institute, today known as UMass Amherst, where we are today, elaborated on the signature monumental style that he arrived at with the Yale A&A building. To critique what he considered the banality and incoherence of contemporary approaches to urban renewal, modern architecture, and campus design, Rudolph imbued these projects with a scenographic quality, fit for the set of an opera, with sweeping staircases, colorful multi-story balcony interior spaces recalling Baroque architecture, and great plazas resembling amphitheaters, inspired by Baroque architecture and the ideas of the 19th century city planner Camillo Zitta. I want to provide a little bit of the kind of intellectual background that Rudolph was very much absorbed in, the theory that he was delving into from architecture. Though it appeared to be one massive structure, the Boston Government Service Center consisted of 2 connected low-rise buildings. These are really 2 buildings of corrugated concrete that formed a courtyard punctuated by a 23-story office tower. The tower was never built. I will call the complex BGSC for short. Originally to have been the work of 3 different firms, the complex was planned to house state and federal offices and facilities for physical and mental health, education, welfare, and social security. The Kennedy and Johnson administrations New Frontier and Great Society programs funded the substantial expansion of these services through the decade of the 1960s. The complex was an integral part of one of the largest, most discussed redevelopment projects of the decade, Boston Government Center, which replaced 60 acres of commercial and residential buildings with a master plan by I.M. Pei and Associates. This is Rudolph's project down here, Boston Government Service Center. Part of a larger effort to revive the stagnating city like what was being done in New Haven, Government Center was the keystone for the new Boston, Mayor John Collins's vision of a city whose renaissance would be symbolized by new modernist landmarks. Rudolph had no interaction with I.M. Pei, whom he knew only slightly, or with Pei's partner Henry Cobb. He was, however, friendly with one of the project's primary administrators, Edward T. Loeb, the director of the Boston Redevelopment Authority, known as the BRA. Loeb had been deputy director for redevelopment in New Haven, which is how Rudolph came to know him well. The Government Center Master Plan exemplified one of the strategies typical of American city planning in the 1950s and early 1960s for redevelopment projects with many buildings. Different architects were given separate commissions in the hope that the results would approximate the urban diversity of the past. This was also a way of satisfying local architecture firms by parceling out pieces of the pie to different firms. The centerpiece was Colin McKinnell and Knowles' acclaimed new Boston City Hall. Rudolph admired the building, a landmark example of brutalism, and was friendly with the members of the firm. The other important buildings in the master plan were the John F. Kennedy Federal Office Building, which we see there, Government Center Garage by Coleman, McKinnell, and Wood, and a large crescent-shaped, which we see there, office building, One Center Plaza by Welton Beckett and Associates. Though critics praised individual buildings in Government Center, it was apparent even in its earliest stages that the complex would have a piecemeal, disjointed feeling, jarringly different from the historic brick and stone buildings and streets that had been demolished. In fact, Government Center represented many things Rudolph thought was wrong with urban planning and redevelopment in the early 1960s. The enclosed, sheltered space plaza of his BGSC was intended as a deliberate contrast to the large, open City Hall plaza. It encapsulates Rudolph's perspective on city planning at the time. For the most part, modernists had favored openness in 20th century urban planning, maintaining that undue density caused social problems and that expansiveness and green park-like spaces were healthful and therapeutic. The early 1960s saw a shift away from this type of thinking, and Rudolph, representative of this shift, had concluded that open spaces caused alienation. Instead, he advocated enclosure, believing that it stimulated strong, positive emotional responses from individuals and the community. Rudolph's notion of what constituted community, however, was unclear, perhaps because of his intense focus on individuality. Rather, his notions about urbanism, enclosure, and communal space, mostly in appreciation of the traditional city's formal aesthetic qualities, were drawn largely from the late 19th century Austrian planner Camillo Zitta's book, City Planning According to Artistic Principles of 1889. Rudolph frequently referred to Zitta in articles and lectures and in discussions about urbanism for his studios at Yale. Like Zitta, Rudolph believed that buildings that shared walls exemplified tighter, more cohesive urbanism. Famously employing the term agoraphobia, a fear of open spaces, to describe the alienating effects of vast urban spaces, Zitta criticized the psychological impact of conventional approaches to planning in the 19th century. His proposal for enclosing the plaza in front of the votive Kirche in Vienna showed how arcades and gateways could be used to shape the open expanses of the new extension to the city, the new areas of the city, into more psychologically comforting, enclosed spaces based on the traditional squares and piazzas of Italy that he admired. So this is Vienna, and this church was already built. It was in a very open space. And Zitta said this space is too open, it's alienating. People get lost in it, they can't navigate through it. And Zitta proposed in his book enclosing or making spaces by enclosing them with arcades. Rudolph really thinks about this approach and takes it to heart. In a way that appealed to the music lover in Rudolph, he enjoyed opera and was a gifted pianist. Zitta thought that the city should be like the stage set for an opera. It would be a Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art, with squares and piazzas for civic activities like parades and communal festivals, which would have the emotional impact of theater, directed by a great conductor or architect. These views confirmed Rudolph's own. Rudolph found especially appealing Zitta's criticism of conventional planning strategies, collaboration, and bureaucratic organization. Zitta said, quote, says this in his book, "Works of art cannot be created by a committee or through office activity, but only by a single individual. An artistically effective city plan is also a work of art, and not merely an administrative matter. That is the crux of the whole matter." Like Zitta, Rudolph believed that individuals, or geniuses, not committees, made the best architecture. Though Zitta was sometimes criticized for favoring traditional architecture, modernists like Le Corbusier and post-war architects and urbanists ranging from Gordon Cullen to Jose Luis Serra, the chairman of the architecture department at Harvard, Eero Saarinen, and others, had long been inspired by his writings. The story of how Rudolph came to design the BGSC in Boston is one about his genius. It is about the architect at the height of his powers, when his virtuosity enthralled his colleagues and appeared to channel the political and economic forces of urban redevelopment into compelling civic forms. As originally conceived, the complex in Boston consisted of 3 independent structures on a boomerang-shaped site. There, you can see it's a boomerang shape. A boomerang-shaped site cleared by the BRA and bounded by Stanford, Merrimack, and New Chardon streets. In keeping with its policy of promoting diversity of expression, the BRA assigned each building on the site to a different Boston architectural firm. M.A. Dyer, True Health, Education, and Welfare, Shepley, Bulfinch, Richardson, and Abbott received employment and Social Security. Desmond and Lloyd were given mental health. Hoping to capitalize on Rudolph's reputation, the chairman of the established firm, Desmond and Lloyd, whose name was Richard R. Theisen Jr., hired Rudolph as a design consultant. This was not Rudolph's commission, really. Theisen, a businessman and not an architect, believed that Rudolph's affiliation of Yale, where he was the chairman of the architecture department, and reputation and design skills could raise the profile of the firm. In effect, Rudolph became the firm's chief designer for mental health and other projects because there's no one of his caliber at the firm. This is an early foray into celebrity architecture. Though the role of design consultant may have seemed inimical to an upholder of individual genius like Rudolph, and indeed it eventually proved to have its drawbacks, Rudolph was initially enthusiastic because Theisen granted him almost complete design autonomy. Additionally, the firm's 30 or so members provided Rudolph with more assistance than his own New Haven office, which was staffed by only about 10 men, and they were all men. Each firm participating in the BGSC produced its own design for a freestanding building, but they soon realized that the structures were poorly related. Rudolph took this moment as an opportunity to expand his involvement. He convinced all 3 firms to meet in New Haven, his home ground, on June 13, 1962. After the members of each firm debated different approaches to their collaboration, Rudolph seized their attention theatrically. In a virtuoso display of his design skills and leadership, Rudolph took just seconds to sketch a plan in which the buildings would be joined together to form a roughly triangular complex. Picture him drawing this in just seconds, supposedly, enclosing a central courtyard focused on a 23-story tower with a pinwheel-shaped plan. Essentially, Rudolph had combined 3 separate buildings into one large structure with just a few masterful strokes. Published in many journals, this is the actual sketch, along with accounts of the anecdote about its creation. The sketch was celebrated as the mark of Rudolph's consummate design skills. Though the concept was no doubt thought out well in advance, and the sketch probably practiced. Rudolph appeared to have arrived at a solution intuitively, in a manner expressive of genius celebrated by Zitta, or in the manner of an abstract expressionist artist who quickly makes his mark upon the canvas. Rudolph was admired for taking action after study and reasoning. The methods he thought most modernist playing emphasized to too great an extent had failed. The final plan for the complex was almost identical to the original pen and ink sketch. Rudolph said of his solution, here's the final plan. Rudolph said of his solution, too many specialists and bureaucrats with overlapping authority created a vacuum which left the way open for an idea. Swayed by Rudolph's ideas, conviction, reputation, and showmanship, the other firms embraced his plan. Loeb named him coordinating architect, granting him the authority to supervise the design of all exteriors. Rudolph outlined 5 design criteria for the BGSC. Though he would have resisted following anyone else's guidelines, Rudolph had no problem prescribing his own. The 5 criteria shed light not only on the Boston building, but on the increasingly dramatic qualities of his other contemporary projects, and also the emergence of a vocabulary common to the large-scale concrete Brutalist buildings at the time. The application of these criteria is evident in the portion of Rudolph's mental health building, this is it right here, visible from the corner of Stanford and Merrimack Streets. This was the portion of the complex he designed entirely himself. The mental health building was intended to be a way station where the deinstitutionalized mentally ill could acclimate to Boston. Relatively free to come and go, clients could sleep in the building's wards, take their meals, socialize, use the gymnasium, swim in an Olympic-sized pool, make art in studios, and receive therapy and treatment. Outpatients could use the building's facilities as well. This is part of an enormous change that's taking place at this time in the care and treatment of the mentally ill, where the large state-run institutions, they're beginning a very long process of downsizing and eventually shutting them down, and the prescription of new drugs that could control conditions like schizophrenia was making it possible for people to move out of these institutions where they had been incarcerated to life back into communities. And this would have its benefits and its drawbacks, as we all know. The first benchmark of Rudolph's 5 criteria was a common material and surface treatment for all the buildings, all 3 buildings in the complex. Rudolph chose for the Government Service Center the corrugated concrete, and that's what he called it. He didn't really call it corduroy concrete, he didn't call it bushhammer concrete, he called it corrugated concrete because it was like corrugated packing material, cardboard. The corrugated concrete he had developed for the Yale A&A building, which was then under construction. Vapi Construction of Boston executed the high-quality monolithic corrugated concrete of the Government Service Center. Though the A&A's corrugated concrete had been developed by Macumber Construction for the particular context in New Haven, the medium quickly became a virtual trademark for Rudolph, employed by him for a range of projects in different settings and emulated by others internationally. The second criterion was massive rectangular piers, which we see all along the edges of the building. These were to vary from 3 to 12 feet in diameter and 4 to 7 feet in height. The piers imparted a sense of rhythmic order that helped unify the complex. For Rudolph, these elements made the large-scale building comprehensible in the context of the city. He believed that passing pedestrians would be able to understand the dimensions of the complex by comparing the size of their bodies to the building's piers. The third standard was a deep cornice line, which we see up here and up here, that would unify the roof lines of all three structures. The cornice consisted of one or more projecting floors, like the studio floors atop the Yale A&A building, that conferred on the complex a top-heavy silhouette, also like that of the Boston City Hall. This profile, which became typical of Brutalist monumentality, derived from Le Corbusier's post-war creations, like his monastery of La Tourette. The fourth criterion was the articulation of all service areas, such as elevators, stair towers, and even toilets, with curvilinear shapes and towers. Such articulation would heighten the complex's expressive character. Rudolph's turrets gave the building a medieval or Baroque quality, which prevailed among his other contemporary projects. The fifth specification was stepped interior facades. This is a model that was photographed around 1962. The fifth specification was stepped interior facades. These are stepped back. The inward-looking facades of all three buildings were required to consist of setback terraces, you could think of it in that way as well, that as a whole would form a bowl or amphitheater-shaped courtyard. You could think of these as the seats of a theater, a giant theater. Rudolph favored this amphitheater-like configuration and setback terraces in other projects of the time, as did his students at Yale, if you look at their student work, and other architects. Can I ask a favor of someone? Could somebody get me a glass of water? Thanks very much.
I'll bring it.
Thanks, I'm running dry. By the mid and late 1960s, Rudolph would often speak of the possibilities. I talked about this as a bowl, but by the mid and late 1960s, Rudolph would often speak of the possibilities of what he called a topographical architecture, a concept whose origins lay in the Boston Project. Thank you very much. Looking for inspiration outside of Hay's master plan, which Rudolph found very inadequate, Rudolph explored ways to give the complex a strong presence in the context of the existing city by making far-reaching connections between old and new. Rudolph claimed that the concave bowl of the courtyard was conceived as the inverse of the convex form of nearby Beacon Hill. And this complex, if you've never visited, is just down the slope from Beacon Hill. It is also the inverse of the gold dome atop the historic State House at the summit of Beacon Hill by Charles Bulfinch, a landmark and symbol of the city. This is the way Rudolph thought about it, establishing these relationships with other landmarks in the topography of the town. Rudolph never built his 23-story tower, which would have marked the government service center in the city, also making it a landmark on the horizon. This is the edge of the tower, and this is a drawing of the tower, a rendering of the tower, to win support for his tower from the BRA. And initially, another firm was supposed to design the tower. It was found inadequate, and Rudolph took over this part of the commission as well. He proceeds in this fashion, a real brinkmanship, gradually taking over different parts of the project, one by one. To win support for his tower from the BRA, state and city officials and the public, Rudolph hired Helmut Jacobi, one of the leading architectural renderers of the day, to make a presentation drawing that was more festive. If you can see this larger, there's lots of people and things down here, than his own impressive but somber delineations. Since he had his own singular way of rendering, Rudolph rarely employed professional renderers. Jacobi's rendering shows Rudolph's poured-in-place concrete shaft rising 23 stories to terminate a series of cornice-like projecting floors and turrets. Fulfilling one of Rudolph's design standards, the cornice gave the tower a memorable silhouette, distinctive from the flat-roofed structures around it. A pinwheel-shaped plan provided numerous corner offices for managers and central work areas for clerks and secretaries. At the foot of the 23-story tower was what would have been one of Rudolph's most compelling pieces of stagecraft, right there. A series of curving staircases making up a giant spiral or knot. Rudolph looked to Italy for inspiration, but it seemed particularly appropriate in this case to find models for the new Boston and the great urban centers of Renaissance Italy, which they believed they would soon equal. Rudolph's decision to model his civic space in Boston on an amphitheater was justified by Zitta, the Austrian theorist, who had asked, "What is a forum but a type of theater?" Another equally impressive piece of stagecraft designed by Rudolph for the BGSC was the lengthy staircase, which we catch a glimpse of here, that he threaded through a covered portico or gateway at the center of his mental health building. A perspective section of gateway-like configuration by Bill Grindring, the head of Rudolph's New Haven office, demonstrated Rudolph's skill at integrating horizontal and vertical spaces. And I bring up Bill Grindring because it's important to understand that all of this work was executed by an office, by many different people. Rudolph supervised all of it, and he exerted a great deal of control over what was done. But these drawings were drawn by other people, and in this case, we know the specific person, Bill Grindring. It demonstrated Rudolph's skill in integrating horizontal and vertical spaces, horizontality of the space coming off the plaza, integrated with the triple height space that we see here. Zitta had recommended such spaces when he said, and using such spaces to create more elaborate urban areas, when he said, the city should have flights of stairs, balconies, gables, and whatever else makes up the picturesque trappings of stage architecture to make the modern city a more engaging place. And Rudolph threads an amazingly elaborate staircase through this portico. Through the portico and through the piers. It is like a staircase from an opera on which an aria is sung in stages. And the staircase wound through the giant piers in the portico, where it becomes a series of steps that flow down to another plaza, and joins to a series of serpentine concrete benches that sustain this sense of momentum and break down into low-rise steps and radiating lines that fan out across the plaza. It's all in concrete, but it's incredibly sensual, and I always think of you're seeing a wing of a bird or something giant and feathered come to rest here. The extraordinary curving forms of the stair and plaza, a vocabulary Rudolph elaborated on throughout the complex, marked an even more expressive turn in Rudolph's vocabulary, one inspired by Baroque architecture, which was itself noted for staging qualities derived from theater. For Rudolph to turn to the Baroque was not surprising, since among the theorists he admired most, Siegfried Giedion had extolled Baroque buildings as models for monumentality and urbanism. Rudolph explained in Space, Time, and Architecture, a book of 1941, which Rudolph said was his Bible, how the undulating walls and flexible floor plans of the late Baroque fostered emotional responses to architecture that he thought modernism could learn from. Gideon's descriptions of the creative ways in which Borromini, the Baroque architect, drew on the classical past without copying it directly inspired Rudolph as well. The most remarkable interior in the complex was the interdenominational chapel perched in a turret high atop the mental health building. Completely curvilinear, it bore an unmistakable resemblance to a giant concrete nautilus shell. Rudolph embraced the worshippers in an oval sanctuary, recalling the elliptical Baroque chapels of Borromini and Bernini, lit by an oval skylight. The pattern of bush-hammered ridges around the oval altar was the most openly ornamental example of Rudolph's corrugated concrete. Archetypal in feeling, like a cave, it was one of several churches Rudolph designed in the early and mid-1960s that demonstrated his affinity for the emotionally charged interiors of religious buildings. Rudolph, like many of his contemporaries, thought it was time to return to the very origins of worship, worship that had begun in caves thousands of years ago. Rudolph has a great feeling for religious buildings because, after all, he's the son of a Methodist minister who grew up in the church, though I think his Methodist forebears would have been shocked at such a Catholic expression of spirituality. With the Boston Government Service Center, Rudolph raised his expressive vocabulary to a more elaborate pitch, which had both positive and negative consequences. It demonstrated the maturity of his architecture and of modernism as it moved beyond the classical phase of the 1920s and 1930s. People at the time talked about the Villa Savoie by Le Corbusier of the late 1920s as being the classical phase of modernism. And in this fashion, just as the Renaissance had taken classical architecture and then from this had evolved into the Mannerist and Baroque periods, modernism would also move forward in this parallel way. BGSC demonstrated how to make powerful, monumental civic architecture. Rudolph and many of his contemporaries imagined that there would be many more opportunities to design civic commissions of this type to keep pace with the growth of big government in the 1960s, and they thought that this would never end. Yet BGSC had many drawbacks as well. Its roughened surfaces, labyrinthine circulation, and dramatic interiors did not provide a conducive setting for mental health services. The complex as a whole did little to remedy the limitations of Pay's government-centered master plan, nor was it successful urbanism. The plaza was too high above the existing streets and secluded from them. And the service center was more of an enormous barrier than a waypoint for pedestrians. But the BGSC's greatest drawback was that it was never completed because of lack of funding and changes in attitude. The two low buildings were finished by 1972, but the tower never was. And for many years, a vast hole occupied its place. Oddly enough, it was the vacuum that existed, the vacuum that Rudolph thought his idea would replace. You could think of it that way. Rudolph amplified the dramatic scenographic qualities of the BGSC in the second project he designed for Desmond and Lord. And once again, this was never really Rudolph's project. He was just a design consultant. The second project was, of course, the Southeastern Massachusetts Technological Institute, known as SMTI, where we are today, the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. Rudolph considered it to be the most complete realization of his experiments with urbanism and monumentality. Architects of the 1960s found college campuses to be ideal places for experimenting with urbanism because of their size, complexity, and possibilities for continuous growth and funding. At SMTI, Rudolph again looked to Baroque scenography for ways in which to stimulate the students. SMTI resulted from, well, you know a lot of this, so maybe I'll give you kind of a summary that you know already. But SMTI, as you know, resulted in the merger in 1960 of two technical schools in New Bedford and Fall River. Local and state political leaders believed that a new institution would could reinvigorate the declining textile industry of the area. Federal and state monies funded the building of the new campus on 700 acres of former pasture and woodlands between the two cities near Interstate 195, one of the new highways transforming the nation. In the post-war era, the highway and the automobile gave rise to a new building type exemplified by SMTI, the commuter campus. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts awarded the commission for SMTI to Desmond and Lord. In an early 1963, Richard Eisen turned the project over to Rudolph. Rudolph would design the master plan and at least one building for this school. The one building would serve as a prototype for additional buildings to be executed by other architects who were very important for this project. Grattan Gill and Jan Hiespelink, if I'm saying that correctly, from Desmond and Lord acted as job captains and themselves designed many buildings based on Rudolph's model. Though the months leading up to the completion of the A building were a very busy time for his office, Rudolph quickly designed the master plan for SMTI. Collaboration between Rudolph and his client was more apparent at SMTI than at most of his other projects at the time. Rudolph worked closely with the Institute's first president, Dr. Joseph Driscoll, who was deeply committed to the humanities. Unlike state politicians who saw SMTI as little more than an elaborate technical school improved for future mill workers by the addition of some college-level humanities courses, we'll give them an English course in creative writing, Driscoll envisioned the new institution as nothing less than a catalyst for the, quote, economic, cultural, and educational renaissance of the financially depressed region. Rudolph and Driscoll agreed that the first new building for the campus would be for the humanities. State officials projected an enrollment of 2,500 students by 1966. But Driscoll had grander plans. He imagined a future university of 25,000 students. That's the size of UMass Amherst. They had to convince people about this. To be convincing, SMTI would have to look imposing, like an already established university, even before it was a university. Rudolph deployed his stagecraft to this end. His easily expandable master plan suggested inevitable growth, and he continually pressed Desmond and Lord's thighs to make SMTI bigger and grander. After the state chose Franchi Construction to build the first building, Humanities One, I think you call it Arts and
Liberal Arts, yeah.
Liberal Arts. Okay, they called it Humanities One, stressing the humanities. Rudolph sent a postcard to Eisen from Venice. Here it is. His favorite vacation spot, this is where Rudolph always went on vacation. He always went to Italy, especially Venice. Asking if $3 million, this is Rudolph's writing, if $3 million was available to build a 450-foot high, poured-in-place concrete campanile taller than the one in St. Mark's Square depicted on the card, as was proposed in his master plan. Rudolph's words are breezily confident. It's not clear whether he's joking when he asks for this. Just a mere $3 million, which is a lot of money in those days.
Half of the entire project, correct?
Maybe, and I don't think it would pay for the air conditioning system that's built in the library.
It would not.
Which is on a full tilt. I appreciate the energy efficiency. But anyway, SMTI was one of Rudolph's few tabula rasa projects. The flat, undeveloped site in South Dartmouth afforded the architect considerable freedom, allowing him to shape the master plan to accommodate both the automobile and the pedestrian. And you know a lot of this already, I think. To accommodate the automobile, Rudolph defined the perimeter. Here's the entrance. Defines the perimeter with a ring road, uninterrupted by stop signs or traffic lights that kept traffic moving smoothly. The ring road strategy was adapted at many other post-war campuses, such as the new University of California, Irvine, or the greatly expanded University of Massachusetts, Amherst, the campus planned by Sasaki and Associates of 1962. The ring road was adjoined by parking lots for 5,000 cars. Presumably every student would have 2 cars. Double the predicted student body for 1966. the parking lots were screened from view by earthen berms, as you know, topped by trees that formed a giant circle, like a prehistoric earthwork, within the ring road. Administrative and academic buildings were inside the area enclosed by the berm. At SMTI, Rudolph moved and molded the earth in both noticeable and imperceptible ways that demonstrated his largely unremarked upon skill of landscape. Unlike at other campuses, at SMTI, no one had to walk much more than a few hundred, this was the intention, much more than a few hundred yards from parking lot to the central building. And I reassured myself with the thought as I parked out in parking lot 13 and I felt I was going to be late. And I thought, well, I only have a few hundred yards to walk. Additional ranges of buildings in the master plan, these of course are not built, this is how it's projected, showed how the campus could be expanded at some future date. Within the berm, wide lawns recalled the expansiveness of traditional American campuses. It looks back to that heritage. The buildings themselves evoke the picturesque, towered skylines of the collegiate Gothic. Two long ranges of turreted buildings. This is the original Humanities one, and then this is Science and Technology over here. Circumscribe the primary communal space at the campus's center, a spiral-shaped mall. And that's what Rudolph called it, a spiral-shaped mall that widens, pivots, and changes direction at the foot of the campanile and an adjacent amphitheater, and then leads out to pastoral views of a pond. An unusual shape for such a space. The spiral was increasingly significant for Rudolph's ever more expressive vocabulary. It's a variation on the novelist shell again. Diagonally aligned walkways guided pedestrians across the mall. To create an illusion of greater length for his open space, and to make the buildings flanking it seem larger, Rudolph angled the ranges of Humanities 1 and Science and Technology. They're aligned at different angles rather than being parallel to one another, and raked the surface of the mall so that it sloped downward to the amphitheater and campanile, subtly creating a forced perspective. He had done something similar with the plaza at the Boston Government Service Center. Such effects, fundamental to scenography, the art of theater design. Theater sets often have raked stages that slope gradually towards the spectator. Fundamental to scenography, as it developed since the Renaissance, were advocated by those whom Rudolph regularly read for advice. Zitta favored trapezoidal plazas, like the forecourt of Bernini's Piazza in front of St. Peter's Basilica. And Gideon, the other author who I had mentioned of space-time and architecture, appreciated the Baroque's ability to make things seem bigger and more compelling than they really were. He wrote in Space-Time and Architecture, in Baroque painting and in architecture, the impression of infinity, the infinite in a linear sense, as an indefinitely extended perspective, is being used as a means of artistic effect. Rudolph's forced perspective at SMTI suggests this type of infinity, but not in a way that was perceptible to the conscious mind or eye. The effects are hinted at by a presentation drawing that shows the view up the mall from a practically airborne vantage point, impossible almost to attain, near the campanile. Illusionary in nature, aesthetics of this type distinguished SMTI from many of the new campuses being built at the same time. One architectural journal pronounced that catching glimpses of the turreted silhouettes of the SMTI campus core while circling it in an automobile amounts to an exciting new type of aesthetic experience. And it's such a rare thing when you give a talk like this that you can actually have the experience that you'll be talking about as you approach the place. So I was thrilled to have the experience as I drove around the ring road. I took the long way around just to have the experience today. I could have come the other way because I was over here by the library. Rudolph was at his most masterful at SMTI, deftly orchestrating his master plan in heightened anticipation for drivers who left their parked cars behind and became pedestrians, caught up in the architectural drama at the center of the campus. When Rudolph first began work on SMTI in 1962, his office was so busy that he did not have time to design each new building for the campus. In fact, he was really somewhat reluctant to even take this project on. He said, "I'm too busy. I'll always have more work and more high-profile projects, perhaps." To compensate for his lack of time, Rudolph developed a system for designing construction, exemplified in Humanities 1, that Desmond and Lloyd and their successors would follow for new buildings. I should stay on this. Integrated ground floor arcades, which we see here, which you know so well, would connect all the buildings along the mall, recalling those of Jefferson's University of Virginia and Wright's Florida Southern College, which were both project models for this project, which Rudolph greatly admired. This organization created the impression of one vast building, an approach used for a number of the innovative new campuses of the time. Rudolph summed up his intentions for SMTI in a single sentence. The campus is intended to be a single building, utilizing a single structural mechanical system to be constructed of one material. Rudolph's building system was based on an underlying rectangular grid of 28 by 14-foot modules, a standard that suggested limitless possibilities for expansion. We see this in the plan. Roughly speaking, this is the 28 by 14-foot module. The basic element of the single structural mechanical system was a giant hollow pier that formed the framework of the building, right there. And that contained, if I open the door, maybe I'll see it, all the heating, that is there, all the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning ductwork. Rudolph rotated the piers, you can see this on the plan, on a 45-degree angle to contrast with the underlying grid and inject a quality of motion into the building. The use of the same material for all buildings, which we see here, a rectangular 8.5 by 16-inch concrete block, also imposed coherence. The manufactured fluted block, and this is what Rudolph calls this, a fluted block, which featured semicircular raised ridges, was a less expensive alternative to Rudolph's corrugated concrete at Yale and at the Boston Government Service Center. That was very expensive to make because they poured it into concrete forms and the masons had to laboriously hand hammer it. It was handcrafting the surface. Rudolph's fluted manufactured block is much less expensive. Rudolph had developed the fluted concrete block, which we see here in many variations, for his Crawford Manor housing for the elderly of 1962. It's developed for this project in New Haven, but you got it here first at SMTI. Not as plastic as the poured-in-place corrugated concrete used for the curving stairs and turrets of the BGSC, that means I should finish up. The block gave SMTI a different but still powerful character. Rudolph's use of the block, the 45-degree angle, and the diagonal axis, like in the walkways crossing the mall, invested the campus with a markedly vibrant staccato quality in comparison to the almost sensual sinuousness of the Boston project. In Humanities 1, rotation of the giant piers eliminated conventional right-angled corners and made many rooms nearly octagonal. The faceted spaces were ideal for ground floor amphitheater-like classrooms or lecture theaters that reiterated the leitmotif of theater throughout the campus, especially the great theater adjoining the hall. So it's one great amphitheater outside, and then the theaters are repeated inside in all sorts of permutations again and again and again. Approaching it from parking lots, visitors to Humanities 1 ascended an impressive zigzagging, coming from the parking lot sides, zigzagging staircase to the main level, passing the angled piers. It supported a series of stagger bays forming projecting upper floors. The projecting cornice was, of course, like the projecting cornices of the Boston Project. The angular vocabulary and non-rectilinear spaces of Humanities 1 were intended to stimulate students, helping them engage with the place and each other. Humanities 1 had few of the monotonous corridors typical of institutional buildings. Rudolph said, quote, "Circulation twists and turns are calculated to bring people together, for alienation is a major problem in commuter campuses." The articulated corridors brought students, staff, and faculty to the multi-story common rooms, which we've seen several times today, especially this photograph, which Rudolph placed at regular junctures in the classroom buildings. Many new campuses of the time had similar communal spaces, always intended to foster community and identity among students who did not live on campus. The common rooms in Humanities 1, some of the most impressive interior spaces designed by Rudolph, were places for students to eat lunch and organize activities, to stage theatricals, including an amateur opera, and at the end of the 1960s to paint anti-war protest banners, though Rudolph never, ever dreamed of protest activities like those that occurred at the end of the 1960s in 1962. He could never have foreseen such a thing. The two common rooms in Humanities 1 and its twin on the opposite side of the mall, the Science and Technology range, were light-filled, spacious, multi-level spaces, different in tone from the complicated interiors of the BGSC or the Yale A&A building. In accordance with Rudolph's precept, this is his phrase, we need caves as well as goldfish bowls. He'd been saying this since 1954. It went back to his early Florida work. Each Humanities 1 common room had an enclosed cave-like area on the ground level, which we failed to see once again, lined with banquettes and focused on a hearth. An unusual feature for a commuter college, to say the least, the hearth was the basis for community in the room, recalling Wright's conception of the hearth as the foundation of family life in his houses. I think Rudolph was also thinking of the campuses of Harvard and Yale, which he knew very well, the residential colleges there, which are known for having many, many living rooms of them centered upon a hearth. He wanted to bring this to the students of the community college as well, this privileged type of space. Rudolph transformed the space above the darkened ground floor into a goldfish bowl lit by enormous glass windows. Balconies appear to float in the air, supported only by a single pier. Each balcony formed a lounge space for the adjacent floor. The topmost level was reserved for faculty, and presumed so they could supervise all below in hierarchical fashion. Carefully chosen brightly colored textiles and carpeting acted as vibrant stimulating foils to the omnipresent concrete. In a 1965 photo, a red banner tied the balconies together visually, working with interior designer Bill Bagnell, who had been his collaborator at the Yale A&A building. And Rudolph really liked to do his own interior design, but he did work occasionally with an interior designer. Bill Bagnell was his favorite. He worked with him several times. Rudolph upholstered the common room banquettes in orange and carpeted the floor with a pattern of orange, red, and purple stripes. The banded carpet echoed the raised ridges of the concrete block, the flutes, and the striations on the poured-in-place structural beams and balconies, and recall the raised ridges of Rudolph's corrugated concrete. You'll never find in a Rudolph building a blank wall, almost. A blank wall, if he could help it. Everything is worked in some fashion. The large glass windows were covered with metal curtains, which we saw earlier. A portion of the metal curtains, made of small discs that rippled continuously, filtering and reflecting sunlight, and projecting changing shadows across the fluted concrete blocks. Now, Philip Johnson, who was Rudolph's close friend and colleague, and Harvard classmate, had achieved similar effects at the luxurious Four Seasons restaurant at the Seagram building in New York with chain link curtains in in 1958. At SMTI, Rudolph brought effects conceived for a 4-star restaurant for the elite to a room where students might be eating brown bag lunches. And before the cafeteria was finished, this is where people came. This was the first building. This building was all by itself for the first few years when it was finished in 1966. So everything took place in these rooms. There was no cafeteria. In their original state, the multiple plays of lines, light, shadow, and color in Rudolph's SMTI common rooms must have been mesmerizing and on sunny days almost kaleidoscopic. Though the brightly colored carpets, curtains, and upholstery are long gone, but maybe I see that they're returning, the common rooms remain sturdy and intact, some of Rudolph's most successful interiors. Humanities 1 was an architectural success, but a professional fiasco for Rudolph. The building impressed those at its spring 1966 dedication, but unfortunately, its magnificence, even though achieved by fairly economical means, dismayed state officials. Citing excessive costs for the next phase, the nearly identical science and engineering range opposite Humanities 1, state officials called Rudolph an expensive architect, a charge that would stick, and reprimanded Joseph Driscoll, president of the Institute, whom they held responsible for encouraging such grandiosity. This was unseemly for a commuter college and for these students. In what became a prolonged drama reported on in the local and national press, a real soap opera, Rudolph was fired in 1966 and then rehired and dismissed several more times. Theisen of Desmond and Lord adroitly held on to the project. He said, we'll just fire Rudolph. Despite the political firestorm, and his firm was retained to complete the campus without Rudolph, local newspapers gleefully repeated state officials' claims that Rudolph was an expensive architect who paid little heed to budget, anticipating similar charges that would soon begin to diminish his reputation. The architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable, however, rose to Rudolph's defense in the New York Times, telling a national audience that Massachusetts officials had little appreciation for great architecture. It was a state of Philistines. Which is true. There was not much Rudolph could do about his dismissal. He had made himself dispensable by creating a standard system for design and construction on the campus. However, he had come to care greatly about SMTI and wanted to complete the project himself, even without credit or compensation. Rudolph conducted backstairs reviews with Gill from Desmond and Lord of the Science and Humanities range, and other buildings like the library. This was never credited as Rudolph's design of the library. Gill and Hieseplin displayed considerable ingenuity in completing the campus according to Rudolph's master plan. Gill was able to build the Campanile, telling the state that it was a communications tower for broadcasting lectures and performances. They did think a lot about that. It really prefigures our own fantasies or excitement about online education, and I wonder if they will come to pass. Rudolph made many comebacks at SMTI. In 1972, he returned and completed the Student Union Building, and he designed other new structures like the Dion Building, completed in 1989. Over the years, SMTI has grown and been transformed into UMass Dartmouth, grand, resilient, and more flexible than its concrete block walls would lead one to suspect. The campus continues to serve students and faculty well half a century after its conception. Rudolph's master plan, systems, and buildings indeed provide a pattern for future growth that will shape the campus well into the 21st century. Thank you. So I don't know if we have any time left.
Yes, let's just open the floor for questions and discussion.
First of all, I'd like to thank you so very much for coming. You have been a real inspiration for me and for my students. For a couple of years now, we've put on 2 shows in the UMass Dartmouth CVPA building, And your words are not at all redundant, but they're very comforting and somehow familiar. But it's lovely to hear them come to life. You have been foundational in our catalogs, which we will send you. I don't think we have, but we certainly will.
Love to see them.
Most foundational for everything that we have done, so I very much appreciate that you're being here. So I will defer to everybody else, of course, for questions.
I have a question about the staircase. Like, is that, you mentioned like it's like a feather, it's like this organic form, and is that like the Rudolph that, is it like an exception of the rule, or is that, like I was kind of shocked to see that as a visual?
Well, the vocabulary of Rudolph is growing increasingly expressive, I would call it, at this time, and so that's an example of that. But I think that Rudolph's architecture is extremely has a lot of sensuality to it in concrete, and when he's using other materials. I mean, his apartment interiors in the 1970s in New York City are spectacularly sensual, I would say. So there's a lot of, he's really interested in fabrics, textiles, surfaces, and he does this, he transfers from one to another using the same sort of aesthetics and patterning. So the corrugated concrete could maybe be repeated with a raised carpet pattern in carpet almost. And he just moves from one to another in different materials, but he really just wants to stimulate the user in every way possible, I think is the agenda. Mm-hmm.
It seems that Rudolph's Boston project has a primal quality to it. It references its location, which is overlooking Boston Harbor.
Yes.
It has cliffs, it has caves, it has sandbars, and is based on seashells.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that's missing is water. And water in the Italian Plaza, of course, activates the space. Why is water missing?
Why is there no fountain? Yeah. I don't know, that's a really good question. I haven't really thought about why is there no fountain?
We have a response to that. Go ahead.
Yes, you do.
These original drawings.
So,
Go ahead.
when Rudolph was designing Dion, and I can't something for the Boston,
Dion, yeah.
but Dion actually in the early sketch of the student union incorporated water, but Dion was supposed to have this like waterfall that would overflow into this reflection pool, and it would be like the demarcation that you have arrived at UMass Dartmouth. It's going to be like kind of like the centerpiece, I guess, of the entrance, but budgetary reasons. See you later.
It was in the drawings, some of the original drawings.
Yes, it was
It had the
In other
words.
projects, like his own penthouse apartment in Manhattan had a series of small-scale canals that flowed out onto the terraces in the middle of Manhattan. But yeah, I mean, there was a piece written by